Well, Hunter Sims, thank you so much for joining me here today and welcome to the highest level.
I appreciate it. It's great to be here.
I'm looking forward to chatting with you about some specific things around kind of your role as an athletic director right now. And I know that you've been working heavily with helping head coaches and leaders in their transition, either stepping into a program for the first time or being a first-time head coach. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. But, I was thinking in anticipation of this conversation, we met back in 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
When I think you had just finished your college playing career, and you had an experience where you played professional football in Germany, and you ended up being a head coach at a really young age. So just kind of like talk about your career leading up to that first head coaching experience, because you became a head coach at a very young age, and just kind of talk about your maturation process up to that point.
Yeah. I appreciate the kind words. For me, I can remember specifically the first time we met was at SMU, and I think I was 24 at the time, and I knew Stevie all through FCA, and really the whole reason I was there is because I was kind of scared to death, for lack of better words. I just got my first full-time job as receivers coach at Howard Payne, and I was like, okay, SMU's doing a pretty good job right now with, we had, Coach Jones and all those guys. Like, what can I do, being nervous as a 24-year-old roughly, was a full-time guy that can get guys to buy into me right away. Like, how can I look older than maybe what I am, since I look like these guys? And so, that was kind of that meeting for us. But I was really fortunate. I played Division III and then got to go overseas to Schwäbisch Hall, Germany, who now has one of the top programs in the nation. One of my best friends, Jordan Newman's the head coach there. I think they're the best team in Europe that play American football. Jordan is 72-2 as a head coach, and so he's got the formula down there. But went over there and then played baseball as well while I was there, and I was also the head baseball coach. So I was basically 22, 23 at the time, the head coach of a team in Germany of a language that I didn't know, but then also I was like the youngest one on the team. Also, it was a men's team. And so I'll come back to that and talk about the maturation process in a little bit. I was fortunate enough to play football. Then I played a year of arena football for the Frisco Thunder and the San Angelo Stampede. And then GA'd with Angelo State. Dale Carr and Scott Clough gave me an opportunity. So I did that for about a year and a half, and then came to Howard Payne and was fortunate enough to move and ascend up pretty quickly, as to what the collegiate standards are, from receivers coach to recruiting coordinator, defensive backs coach to assistant head coach, offensive coordinator, through a coaching change. And then in the fall of 2015, was named head coach going into the 16 season. And I was 29 at the time, and very wide eye going into it. And then 4 months later, was named the athletic director at Howard Payne also. And so I got some really good advice both ways. Hey, if you're going to do it, it might as well be you rather than working for somebody else. And so pushed really hard for it and was fortunate, got the job. And I think there's a lot of reasons for it. Most notably probably being one, I don't know how strong the applicant pool was. And then number two, I'm a big believer in grow where you're planted and try to be the best at what you do, whatever position that is, whether it's assistant coach, a coordinator, head coach, or whatever sport. And then, try to be the best in your conference, but always prepare on your free time for that next role, because I think it's vital. We all know the coaching industry and how fast it works, that when there's a job that comes open and then it's filled pretty quickly. So you better have your stuff ready. You're behind if a job comes open, whether it's internally or externally, and you think, hey, I'm interested, I need to get some stuff ready. Well, you've already missed the boat. And so I think it's just critical to be the best at the job that you can be when you're on the clock, and then off the clock on your free time, you need to be preparing for that next position up. So anyway, so I say that's a little bit of my background, and we can kind of go from here.
Yeah, and you were kind of referencing, the maturation process, and you talked about being a head coach in a country that you'd never lived in before, speaking a language that you didn't know how to speak, and just kind of talk about kind of maybe your early lessons. I appreciated that you acknowledged a little bit of your maybe anxiousness at an early age, and I think any young coach can relate, regardless of the authority position that they step into. But just share a little bit about your early learnings and kind of like those early lessons in leadership.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. So, for me, the early lesson was that I had to learn is, working camps and all that through college. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm a head coach now. I'm 23 of this baseball team. And, on the football, it was like, I've got to do everything that I can to prove and to show that my vocabulary is awesome. And I know so much more than everybody else, and that just kill them with knowledge that, I'm going to be the X's and O's guys, and I'm here for a reason, and, innovative, cutting edge and all that. And what was really cool about it is I had three really close friends there. One that was a mentor, his name was Heiko Summer. Obviously Jordan Newman was there, and then Phil and Jurgen, who ended up being two of my best friends. And they basically said, hey, look, English is our second language. All the stuff you're telling us, we're not retaining, that like, it's impressive that this stuff. And they didn't say it directly that way, but the conversation evolved. And basically the way that I realized pretty quickly was, hey, if I'm giving instruction and, 11 words will do, how can I do it in 4 to 5? And so what is my main point that I want to get across? If put any coaching point in there, like, if we're elbow up or swinging the bat or squashing the bug, any of those, elementary terms that we're using, how can I say that to emphasize those 4 words to know what we're doing, rather than trying to impress people with the knowledge? And so what I've always tried to do is carry that on completely. And that's probably the biggest thing that probably helped me out, was to be a better, direct, effective, definitive, decisive communicator that just said, okay, this is what I need from you. This is how we're going to do it. And then let's focus on that and move forward. And I think I was fortunate enough to learn that at an early age, that I don't have to try to impress everybody, because if, let's say, I know 100% of the information and I'm, just overdoing it with all of our coaches or student athletes, but they're only retaining 25% of the information. And then the coach next to me, he only knows 75% of stuff, but they retain 50%. Their student athletes are way better off than the guy who's actually smarter and knows more, because it's all about what they can retain at the end of the day. And so we had some success in baseball and football over there. And so I just took that with me everywhere that I went to. So when I moved up in these positions, fortunately, it was a good lesson that I was able to take, that, hey, yes, I'm expected to be the expert in the room at receiver or at defensive back or offensive coordinator or head coach or AD, but I need to be able to command respect with how I carry myself, but I need to be able to emphasize my points without over analyzing information to give to everybody. So I would say that was probably the biggest thing that helped me in my maturation process.
Yeah, I love that. Kevin Eastman, a former NBA assistant coach, was on my podcast recently, and he talked about in coaching, so oftentimes we think we need to speak in paragraphs. And in reality, what hits best and what can really influence the players most profoundly is speaking in bullet points. And I think that's a realization that any coach would come to, and kind of cool that you had the dynamic of kind of like speaking across language barriers as well to learn that lesson. And you mentioned earlier about being a really young head coach. I mean, 29 is a very young head coach. Even if you were a full-time assistant for the first time, that's still pretty young. Talk about I don't know if this was the case with you, but I would imagine that there was some part of like imposter syndrome where you're thinking, man, I'm so young, I maybe look young as well, and now I'm taking on this leadership role. On one hand, yes, you are the authority figure, you have to take charge. But on the other hand, when you kind of go home at night and you look at yourself in the mirror, there can be a little bit of self-doubt or maybe questioning yourself. Did you go through that at all as a really young head coach? Just talk about being a head coach at such a young age.
Yeah, yeah. So I will tell you, my imposter syndrome started the day that we met. You know what I mean? Like, hey, I'm a full-time, college coach. This was always my dream. And the reason I'd searched out these schools in Texas to go visit is I felt like I had to inundate myself with information that the students never saw through me, guys that were actually 2 years age difference from me. And so, yes, and I actually hit that at every stage, then moving over from defense and never coaching defense before, and then as a coordinator, and then as a head coach. And so I think the thing with that is, all these like cliche, catchy sayings that you hear people say, it's about relationships, and I'm relational. So that's really easy for me, and probably more of an extrovert, people would say. But I'm a 100% big believer that people do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so if I can just express, the little things as far as, hey, how is your, girlfriend doing? How's your boyfriend doing? How's your brother, your sister, your dog? And like, remember their names, that people are going to buy into me and believe in what I'm doing. Now, when I go out and ask them, to perform X to make our team better, they know that I have their best interest at heart. And so I think sometimes we skip over that a lot, to try to prove, the imposter syndrome, that, hey, I know more than what I do. And so I think nobody's ever told me this directly, but I think in my situation, and I'm a big believer in this, what I think is absolutely vital is you got to grow where you're planted, but also you got to get involved. And so if people don't know you on campus, whether it's middle school, high school, college, then it's going to be hard for people to go to bat for you and fight for you. So whether that's, volunteering and being on committees, or, involved in organizations that are outside your particular sport or your particular department, the more relationships and allies you can build, just the better off that you have the opportunity to advance within the system, for a lack of better words, that you might be in. And so going back to that imposter syndrome thing is that, when you're trying to move up, you want people to say, oh yeah, that's a good hire, right? So everybody wants to make sure that they make a splash hire, or make sure that they don't miss. The more people that support that decision, the better off, the person hiring is. And so I think it's just super important that a lot of us don't do enough in our profession, is get outside of our box of, whether it's athletics or if you're in some other department or business. Hey, are you well known? And not just kind of being fake networker, but, are you genuinely, there to help?
Yeah. It's interesting because you were just talking about the simplicity of communication. Mm-hmm. And, I love that saying as well. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think that as a young coach, I can relate to what you just said, where it's like, I thought I had to have the answer to everything. Mm-hmm. And I thought I had to make up for the fact that I wasn't a high level college player or a pro player. And in reality, very few people even care about that, or even expect you to have all the answers. And you don't really kind of learn that until later and as you mature. And that's what I'm kind of hearing from you, is kind of like almost this simplistic nature of being a good human being, being a good person, being the type of person that you would want in your own program, and kind of emulating that and using that as an example, for what you want your program to stand for.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, I appreciate those kind words, but the thing about it is it's all about playing hard and building relationships. And I think the hard part of that, going back to it, is I've seen, statistics and data, and you don't know what's peer reviewed and, truly and fully out there, been through the full scope of, a survey. But, the common theme that I hear is that, students or even employees don't really know the impact you had on them till 3 years after they're removed from your presence. And so, what's hard as coaches sometimes is you're not going to get that instant feedback. And then also as a young coach, where you draw the line of friend and mentor or friend and leader, not knowing that you're going to get instant gratification from that relationship and just being able to hold on to it. And so something that I've done that can seem maybe narcissistic, I guess, but it's been really important to me and it's helped me grow as I talk about invisible paychecks a lot with our staff, that when a student comes back to visit you, or when they write you a letter, they sent you a text or whatever, you cannot just gloss over that and not celebrate that as a win, because as a mentor, you're striving for that when they're with you. And then now when they're gone, we're not going to acknowledge that. Like, we don't give enough, attention to that kind of stuff. And so one thing that my dad encouraged me to do when I was a player and coming up is like, hey, write down all the things you liked or didn't like, and then try to implement that when you're younger, when you knew you're going to go into the coaching deal. And then I basically took that a step further with anytime that I get like notes or messages from former students or people on campus or whatever, hey, Hunter, thank you for being involved in this, or thank you for doing this, or you made an impact on this. I take it, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but I take it, I hole punch it, and I put it in a binder and I date it. And so I've got about 3 binders filled up right now of, in chronological order of things that I just flip through when I'm having a bad day, or I start to question, why am I doing this? Or it's taking up so much time, that I can go back and flip. And people who shared were willing to take time out of there to share that they were thankful for me. And it's been huge. And that's what I mean by an invisible paycheck, as far as being able to say, okay, what are we doing this for? What is the impact? And I just think so much, like I said, it can seem maybe kind of narcissistic, but it's helped me and my spirits, or else, I would have just thrown that away and not really thought about it again.
Yeah, I don't think you should be embarrassed about that at all, Hunter. Because I'll share with the audience as well that I do something very similar.
Right.
And I screenshot my texts, and I screenshot those emails, and I have a folder that I keep on my digital organizer. That's the exact same thing. And I think like this also goes back to another piece, which is kind of self-leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And managing yourself, managing your own emotions, because I can relate to exactly what you just said, where like we all have days, regardless of whether you're the leader on campus or the highest performer on a team. Like, we all have those days where we're just not feeling connected to our mission or our purpose, and reviewing the impact that you have, the influence that you've had in the past, and even still to this day. And really those small wins really can go a long way towards building confidence. And that's what I personally use it for. So I'll stand right there with you, man. And maybe it is a little narcissistic, but it's also beneficial to review those on a periodic basis to kind of reconnect you to your work and help create that clarity for why we do what we do.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I appreciate that. All right. Strength in numbers.
Strength in numbers, right. Invisible paychecks. Love it. And obviously you've had this career where you keep talking about bloom where you're planted. And this is a saying that my mom would share with me all the time throughout my coaching career. And it's very common, and especially in coaching, to kind of be looking into the future, or the grass is always greener. And if I was just a D1 coach, or if I was just promoted, like everything would be fine. And there is great power in really just giving yourself to this day, and like you said, bloom where you're planted. Talk about kind of like this evolution of moving up within a program, because obviously you moved up at Howard Payne from an assistant coach to the head coaching role, and then, as you mentioned earlier, shortly thereafter you added the title of athletic director. And for coaches, we spend our whole life preparing to lead a team. Now you're in charge of an entire department. So just kind of talk about the evolution of moving up within a program, and kind of like your own evolution, taking on the head role of the athletic department.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I wasn't ready, and I can tell you for any of those roles, I wasn't ready, but just kind of having the blind faith to do it and following God's call, and being prayerful about it, but also, being confident about it as well too. And so when kind of looking back on that time, for me, it was important that the people that I knew, that I was around, knew that I believed in them also. And so when I first got the director of athletics role, I knew it would be kind of difficult because in virtually 7 years, or a little bit less than 7 years, I went from kind of the lowest paid position on the football staff, to director of athletics. And people that had been on staff longer and all those things. And I knew that there would be some barriers to work through, but I knew that it was important to let them know that I cared about them and their program and their success as much as my own. And so, two really big things that stuck out that I stumbled upon, and I wish I could say I had this plan and vision, but I think it just worked out more as I asked them, all of our head coaches and head athletic trainer and strength coach and all that, and said, hey, bring me the three biggest liabilities to your program of being successful, and then bring me your three greatest assets. And so what it helped me to do was explain to them, okay, I know we need to work on these things, but not only do we need to work on these things, let's kind of redirect or rephrase the question to, let's accentuate these great assets that you have. So instead of focusing on the negative of what we don't have or what's wrong, then let's take these three, let's be aware of both of them, but then let's take the three. And if this is kind of our bailiwick, for lack of better words, we probably have more potential for growth in these areas than these areas of weakness, and let's address them. And so I think that helped our staff pretty quickly to know, okay, now when I'm talking with donors or talking with alumni or staff or people on campus that can actually make things happen, I know the three greatest needs for those that I'm leading and working alongside that they need to make their department better and stronger. And so we talk a lot about being the chief executive officer of your area. Like, I need you to be the CEO of that. I need you to fight for that, but you got to keep me informed of how I can come alongside you and make that better. And then going from there to, okay, then how do we lead and how do we do things and how do we implement? So I think you kind of asked from like within, how I did that from within, or what would I, attribute that to. And I think something that was very valuable is, there's the 30, 60, 90-day approach, where you listen, you analyze, and then you implement. And I took that a little bit further and probably went a step slower in that. And what I did is, went through the 30, 60, 90, but then I listed the 50 top things that I thought we need to address or change in the athletic department after about 60 days. And then what I did is I went through and I ranked them 1 to 50 of what I thought was most critical and pressing to least pressing. And then I categorized those by finance and time, which basically meant like, okay, I know we need lights on our baseball field. And that's critical, but it's not realistic right now financially. And so I broke those down into two categories. I'll get to my point. But so then I ranked them, 1 to 50 of them, what was realistic. And then we started checking them off. But what I did was with our coaching staff, what we did together is then we just implemented 3 a month. And so what it allowed us to do was I didn't come in and say, hey, what we did was terrible before, and try to wholesale change as we implemented 3 things that way, back to that simplicity thing. A coach and myself or whoever's not overwhelmed by, okay, we need to document this differently. We need to, work at fundraising for this and that. Oh, well, it's 3 things that I need to do for the month. And then the next time we met, it was 4, 5, and 6, and then 7, 8, 9. And then you look up and you're 1 year into it and you've got 36 to 50 things. Some things are real easy to checklist. But I think that slow process, like internally, that I think it really bought or helped the buy-in for me that, hey, we weren't going to wholesale change. We were going to stay strong in the things we thought, but then we were going to make these adjustments as we went.
Yeah, first of all, that's a really cool insight and a cool story. So I appreciate you sharing that. Also, I love the power of asking the right questions, and also just kind of like your acceptance of like, we can't attack all 50 of these problems right now. We need to prioritize. And something that I've been really looking into recently, and this is not a new thing, but just kind of the idea of controlling the controllables.
Gotcha.
And having, coached at the Division III level, and for any coaches out there that have had experience at the lower levels of college, there are realities that you just can't match. Howard Payne is going to be very different from an SMU just in terms of the resources. And it was so beneficial for me as a coach to have those experiences at McMurray to kind of like understand that you don't need all of the quote unquote bells and whistles to be successful. It's really about kind of being smart with the resources you have. And like you said, asking the right types of questions of the people that you're leading. I really like that. And this kind of leads into the work that you're doing right now, the study for your doctorate program. And I'd love to talk about that a little bit, because you made a comment earlier about like how you weren't really ready to take on some of these leadership responsibilities. And your study is really around this 1-year onboarding process. And I'll let you tell it more in depth. But to start with, why did you choose this as kind of like your area and focus of study for your doctorate program?
Yeah. So there's kind of 2 things here that I've kind of studied, and we can go kind of either way. But one of them is just basically focusing on Division III universities about the ADID position, which a lot of people do not know a lot about, which is an athletics, diversity, and inclusion designee, and how can they find or study or implement best practices to maximize that role. And so what a lot of people don't know is that was implemented about 3 or 4 years ago from the NCAA, and there wasn't a lot of direction behind it to plow forward. I'm that position for us at Howard Payne, the athletics, diversity, and inclusion designee. Well, going back to what you said, we're not going to have the same resources as, school X that's a part of a major Power 5 or Group of 5. And so, at the lower level, it's going to be more dual role. We're not going to be able to hire a staffer or staff or a department to tackle that area. And so what can we do to implement best diversity and equity and inclusion trainings and all that kind of stuff to help somebody like, myself to be able to implement best practices for that serve in dual roles. And then there's a second part of it that I was trying to find, I guess, cross-sectionality isn't really the right term for this, but like how there's all this information and encouragement, like, here's how you hire, this is how you hire, this is the right person, all these interviews and things that they tell you. But then when they come on board, where does it go from there? And that was something that I just had to learn over time. And unfortunately, having been in this role for 7 years now, I've had to go back and apologize to some of my head coaches that are still on staff, or some that have moved on, like, hey, I didn't do a good job, with you coming on board with us. And so what that means is I try to take a little bit more proactive measure. Now, I'm not the best at it, as I've tried to implement this over a few years. But as I mapped out 1-year onboarding for a first-year head coach at Howard Payne. And so basically I've got 52, weeks or areas that mapped out, like, over a 1-year calendar year of what we need to do. And so what I do is right when they get onto campus, right? Like, college athletics never stops. Like, there's not a starting point and ending point. Like, when you get in, you're hitting recruiting, you're re-recruiting your own team, you're finding new ones. It's non-traditional season, it's regular season. So nobody ever comes in at the right time. And so I have a meeting once a week with a new head coach. And what I had to learn my lesson on is didn't matter if they were a first-year head coach, or their first time head coach in college, or if they had been a college head coach for 10 or 15 years. The way we do things at our institution might not be the way that you've done it at school X before. So how can I shortcut, for lack of better words, the onboarding process for them to get used to it, or to get in their mind, okay, you did it this way there, but you're going to kind of have to do it this way here, and implement a good way about going about that. So I would love to talk in more detail about it, if that's what you're kind of getting at.
That is what I'm getting at. And
Okay.
Either you can, like, choose an area that you think either that you've been kind of, like, focusing the most on in terms of that improvement. And I'd love to know kind of, like, what either the feedback has been from those coaches, or kind of, like, where you feel you still have to improve on this process.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit more of a broad way of looking at it, and then I'll break it down and see where you might want to go, just
Cool.
to anybody listening, a little bit more idea of what I'm kind of getting at. So I'll do a weekly meeting, and not to be micromanaging, but just to get that coach that we have time together set aside, that they can ask me questions for the first 12 weeks that they're on our campus. So I say, whatever time fits best for you, I'll make my schedule work around that. And then I have a set questions. Do you have any issues from the last time we met? Did you pick up anything creative on our campus from the last time we met? So it might be something I need to implement with the rest of our staff, or make sure everybody knows about, or what they've done here. Always ask us, how are you and your family getting settled in with housing, moving, any issues there with the transition, just because I think we can easily brush that off. And then, as always, tell me how recruiting's going, because that's our lifeblood of that. And so the first 4 meetings, I planned for about an hour and a half. And then the 8 after that, I planned for an hour. And so once we get to our 12th meeting, we'll start meeting every other week. And we basically do that every other week from week 14 to week 23. And then week 25, through 52 moves to more of once a month. But keeping in mind that we meet, all of our head coaches meet once a month too. So we actually have 2 sit-down meetings, one group, one individual, through those weeks, and just cover everything. And so, if it's in a perfect world, like week 1 is like the staff handbook and, how we order our stuff through Nike. Week 2 would be recruiting, and I do a meeting with the compliance officer, and then meet with our VP of admissions. Week 3's budget, for financial aid. registrar's office. Week 5 is faith integration with us and our team and our chapel. 6, strength and conditioning, then fundraising, scheduling, donors, business, and then like our drug testing policies, and then like our camps. Like that's like the first 12 weeks. I know that's a lot of information there, but what I want to do is a snapshot of what those coaches could ask. And then depending on what time of the year they come in to Howard Payne will depend on which week we pick up at so if they come in around April or May, we might start off with the handbook always and then go right to camps. How does camps work, all that stuff. So so that's just kind of a broad overview of it, because I think the onboarding process is critical.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love the attention to detail, because I think that, you go into a new situation and there's so many things that are happening, and you're solely focused on recruiting or kind of whatever the next piece is within your program. And all of these other things kind of like fall through the cracks, or can fall through the cracks. And I love the attention to detail. I'd love to hear just kind of like from your perspective so far, like where do you see head coaches struggling the most within kind of like this 52-week period? Or is it different for depending on the sport and the individual?
Yeah. So just a generic answer would be administratively. So budget, not saying that they follow it well, but just like the vision of the budget, of seeing out months in advance, and then just administrative work, and especially with younger staff, but like, hey, it's not all about the coaching on the field or our academic work. Then how are we following up in all these administrative areas then with budget, and then having the foresight to project out a year in advance? Because I think if you're not have planned out 6 months to a year in front of you, then you're behind. So what you're doing in the present, like in the month of July that we're in right now, I should have already had planned out about 6 months ago to what I would be doing this July, or else you're always just chasing your tail. And so that's why I think year 1 is so important, because it helps project out, okay, what are we doing now? And let's knock these things off the list, but how does that affect us for next year? And so, staying within budget, what do we need? What's necessary? What's essential? And then just charting that stuff down is like, hey, I thought I needed that for next year, but maybe I need to go ahead and get it now. So I would say that's probably the area that I myself also, I don't want to put that out there, because I was weak in that area as well. Because to be honest with you, like I wasn't I didn't get my MBA, you know what I mean? And I've told my wife, Shannon, so many times, she was like, if you could go back and do it differently, what would you do? And I was like, well, if I knew I was going to be an administrator and only in college, I wouldn't go education. I wouldn't get, some of those have been great, but I'd probably go more like counseling with a business undergrad, because that's what I, work with, relationships and budgets. So I think our coaches coming up just aren't strong in that area, because it's the first time they've really had to do it.
Yeah. As you were kind of like describing it, I was thinking in my head, I was like, this is almost kind of like a pseudo business school, in addition to like learning how to lead a program, because like you said, there are so many things that you need to be projecting into the future and planning for and budgeting for. That's really great to hear, and totally, understandable that would be difficult. Cause like in my mind, I'm thinking like, okay, yeah, you can know what you want to do in July, but so much happens in the span of 6 months, especially like within a college football program, or just a college athletic program, that things probably are changing. And I would imagine it would be very different. So I can understand how that would be maybe a little challenging, especially for first-time head coaches.
For sure. So if I were to give some advice, I was really lucky. Roger Geis was the head coach here when I was the offensive coordinator and assistant head coach. And he basically turned over the budget to me as we work through it together. And so that's what I would encourage anybody that's in that kind of second in command position to request more responsibility in that area. That way it's not just this huge overwhelming burden that they've never looked at the budget or the line items or anything like that. Because we all think, oh, if I was the head coach, I would do this. And it's like, well, there's not any money there. So, you won't do that. So I think that's a real, big deal, is that, hey, when you get into those positions, ask for more of that administrative responsibility. That way it's not, such a shock to your system when you get it.
Yeah, I love this advice too, because I think my natural reaction as a leadership coach is to look at the leader and say oh, the head coach should be doing that. You
Right.
should be developing your staff. But you bring up an excellent point, which is if you're a young assistant coach, or you're just an assistant coach and you have aspirations of being a head coach or even higher than that, take that responsibility upon yourself. And,
Right.
and that might actually be a huge help to support a head coach or a leader to take, even if you're not making the budget decisions, maybe you are just putting the budget together and presenting it to that leader. That's an excellent point there. So I really like that. Quick nerd question for people that do research and write papers like this. How are you measuring the success of this 1-year onboarding process? Is there anything that you're doing right now to try and measure that or collect data on it?
Yeah. So the higher ed answer, I guess, for lack of better words, is you do a if you're doing a qualitative, study, which is basically more on relationships and interviews, that, like a pre questionnaire through that, and then obviously through the training, and then you're doing a post questionnaire, that interview, for lack of better words, that says, hey, was this helpful? I mean, that's the simplistic way to do it or not. And then or another thought can be more of a mixed methods, where it's truly, you have a larger group, usually over 100, qualitative stays more between 7 to 10, and you kind of get a little more personal. And then quantitative, you'd have to have more of 100 people roughly involved in it. And then it's more like, a survey monkey to see it. But this particularly is just more relational, which is more towards where I lean, if this is going to add value or not. And I've actually gone back and done this with some of our coaches that are past their first year, and it's always like a backhanded compliment when they're like, hey, this is great. I wish I would have had this my first year. And I'm like, yeah, all right, I got it, so. But that to answer your question, that way, just more, kind of the interview process with pre and post questions.
Interesting. You mentioned interview process, and one of the last things I wanted to touch with you on was, as an athletic director, you are charged with hiring leaders within your program, and specifically head coaches. And I want to talk about two parts. One is identifying candidates, and then the second will be the selection process. But just kind of talk about identifying the candidates when you're looking for a head coach, and kind of how you go about that initially when you start thinking about hiring for a new head coach to lead a program.
Yeah. So I'm going to do a prequel here. I'm going to pre-answer my own question before I answer your question.
Love it. Love it.
But because I get this a lot, and I think it's really valuable information that I try to share, because I get a lot of how do I get this job? Or, Hunter, can you reach out to somebody for me? Or what do I need to be doing to become a head coach? And I love it. And one of the things that I want to start either this year or the next year is a little training deal with our assistant coaches, that it's a presentation I've started putting together that says, so you think you want to be a head coach? And it just kind of goes through the checklist of how's your resume, what's your 1-year recruiting cycle look like, all that. Because I think when coaches go out to interview, they represent us, like Howard Payne, directly. And if they don't go interview well, that's not going to shed a good light on us. And so I want them to be prepared for that. But it's funny to me, because I was the same way, is it's like, we all talk about this coaching tree and coaching network, right? I know the OC at the school, and I'm an OC, and I'm know the defensive coordinator and the head coach, and all these things, and like my network is awesome. And it's funny to me because I was the same way, but it's like, yeah, but how many ADs do you know? Like the OC at that school is not going to be doing the hiring. They can put in a good word for you, but they're not the hirer, for a lack of better words. And so that's what I've kind of given a lot of advice about, is like when assistant coaches go and, ask me like, how do I do this? Like with our basketball coaches or soccer or softball that are assistants, I always encourage them to go introduce themselves to the AD at whatever school they're visiting. And it's like, if the AD doesn't know you really, they're not going to know to hire you. And so backing back into your question now, like we always are pretty comfortable with hiring people we know, or people that know somebody that you can get a quality reference from. And so you need to make yourself known genuinely, but not necessarily just through the coaching tree of your peers of, who's the one in charge of hiring that position actually, and getting on their radar. And so I think what's probably really difficult at a small school is we have standards and values and where we want to hire, and then there's a salary tied to that, and can you get and meet all those requirements going through that selection process. So like when a resume is sent out, and you're going through it, what do you have that jumps off the page? That's what I always like to talk about. So when you're saying, what does that selection process look like for me, is like, okay, what differentiates them from the next person? What jumps off the page? And I know that this is a quality hire if I hire this person for position X, even though I know that they would be great at position Y. And so what I mean by this is, to me, a quality hire is if I hire somebody as an assistant soccer coach, but could they be the head coach? Then I know that I feel like I have the right person for the job, and I feel like I've gotten a steal, for a lack of better words. And so that's what I'm always looking for. So if it's, in football and Coach Bechtel comes to me and says, hey, we want to hire X for a coordinator, this person, it's like, what I'm looking for is, could they be the next head coach? That's really what I'm looking for. And the same thing as assistant in any sport, can they be the next? If I'm looking at a GA, could they fit right into, being an assistant? So to answer your question directly, that's what I'm always looking for, because it makes my job easier, right? Like they know our standard, that if they've been with us for a year, then that they can slide right into it. So for me, that's vital, that I'm really trying to hire for the next position as much as I'm hiring for the one that's actually open.
Very, very good insight. I really like this because I think, in my studies of talent acquisition specific to players, we often look at the talent, we look at all these other things, but rarely do we really kind of consider the developmental profile of those people, right? Like, yes, this person is a 22-year-old that we're drafting in the draft, and maybe they talk about, oh, this guy could be this, right. But like, what is actually that realistic developmental path? And that's what I'm kind of hearing from you too, is where you're kind of looking at it. Yes, like obviously, you're looking at potentially younger, candidates to fill assistant roles and especially GA roles. But there's also this element of like, could I see this person developing into, somebody that can command the room, right. That can lead the group of people that they're going to be in charge of. Really cool insight. And then I'd love to just touch on the selection process, because obviously you've identified people that maybe either have the potential to develop, or that they have those traits, those things on the resume that jump off to you. When you start getting down to like those last few candidates that, you're kind of weighing, who am I going to make this decision on in terms of like being in charge of this program? What are the things that kind of become the difference makers or those decision-making factors for you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So this is the part of my job that I dislike as much as anything. I was telling one of our coaches the other day that I would rather, part ways with somebody or mutually part ways or let somebody go than I would rather make the phone call to whoever got number two in the job for interviewing. And it's really difficult for me because it's such a really fast-paced relationship, getting to know them. And then, we're telling them all the reasons that they could be a great fit. And then they're telling us all the reasons why they feel led or could be a great fit for us. And then when we go with somebody else, the phone call that I dread the most is, saying, hey, we went with somebody else because you built this relationship, that there could be a great fit. It's just not the right time or not them, or, in some ways the other person just sold themselves better. And so I say that to say, so when we start to narrow it down, I work really closely with Troy Drummond, who's our associate director of athletics for all of our operations, and work with him. And then my report, Dr. Penland, one of our vice presidents here, because what I want to do is I'm looking for in a head coaching role, who's going to be the best head coach for us. And then what I asked Coach Drummond to look at is, okay, who's going to be the best team player for us? And then what I ask, Dr. Penland to only look at it as, okay, who's going to be the best influence for our campus? And so that's not going to work everywhere. That's not going to be a great model everywhere. But for us, that I've found out is the individuals that are successful at Howard Payne are those who are great teammates with the other coaches, good head coaches, and then also good ambassadors for our campus. And so rather than trying to figure all those answers out for myself, I'm trying to divide the workload a little bit that says, hey, you just focus on this area and then give me your feedback.
Yeah, this is interesting because I think a lot of times we look at talent and obviously I wrote a book on intangibles, so I believe fully in that. But there is this other piece, which is kind of the culture fit and the team fit. And just because you can be a great head coach or a great leader of men or women does not mean that you're always a great fit, whether it's Howard Payne or any other school. And I have this theory that situations impact so much of success. You look at sports and we know that's the case, right? I always tell people Patrick Mahomes is a great quarterback, but if he's the quarterback for the Detroit Lions without Andy Reid as his head coach, he's probably not as impactful. He's probably not an MVP player. And I think it goes in life just like that. If you can find a situation where you are a really good fit for the place that you're going to be at or the team that you're going to go on, in addition to having the talent, in addition to having these intangible skills that drive success. Now that's kind of that's kind of the perfect storm, the trifecta that I think we are looking for. And I think really interesting too, that you as an athletic director kind of use that as maybe your final filter, so to speak, where it's okay, we know that these three candidates can do the job, and we know that they can be probably really successful in this role. And kind of that last filter is who is going to be that person that we want on our team, or that's going to be the best fit to be on our team.
Right. And I think it's also important for the person to ask, just very directly, if I'm interviewing and you're doing the hiring, okay, Evan, what are you looking for? Exactly. What do you need? Because there's a lot of times this pendulum swings that we all, and myself included, have a hard time of reining in our emotions of hey, our last coach did this, so we need this over here on the opposite side. And sometimes we swing too far. But if you don't know exactly what they're looking for, it's also hard to sell yourself and your culture and, all the buzzwords that you want to put in there for what they're looking for. Because you can very fastly talk your way out of You know what I mean? Of like, hey, we're not looking for that. We need more of a team player this time around. Or, hey, actually, and I've done this before too, is we actually need somebody more selfish that's going to defend their area more, because that's going to help me push their area, because they've got to really push it and I need help. And so I think asking, and then at the end of all the interviews and as that selection's going down too, is always follow it up with, is there anything I can circle back to? Anything that I hit on that I can give some clarity in case you misspeak on something, or that you might have caught their ear a little bit, that gives you a chance to speak into more, whether it's maybe culture or planning or practicing, of really trying to key in on, like for me, when we're hiring, we've got it down to our top 3. You got to find out, what are they looking for?
Yeah. Well, one more question on this.
Yeah.
You brought up something just a moment ago. You said like culture.
Yeah.
And I know that like there was a really famous clip going around Twitter about 6 months ago where all these coaches that had just been hired as head basketball coaches were saying, we're going to do things the right way. Yeah. And they all said the exact same thing in their press conference. It was pretty funny, right? Like everybody is saying the same thing. Right. But saying like you're going to do it the right way, or saying like we're going to build a culture based on the team or whatever they say, how do you pick apart like what they're telling you versus like actually making a decision like separate of just what they're saying in the interview? Or is it just kind of like getting a feel for that person and just like, do you feel they're being honest? Just kind of talk about how you kind of parse through maybe some of that coach talk and get to like who they actually are as a leader.
Yeah. So I pride myself on trying to be transparent. Sometimes I think I'm transparent to a fault, but I feel like over information for what's going on around us is good. Everybody feels like they have ownership in it. So our coaches know that a lot. And I'm real big also on, hey, don't bring me a problem unless you've thought through it, that you maybe have an idea of also how to fix it. Like, I'm not saying you have to have the idea, but then what's the angle of what we're going to go to fix that being number one. And then number two, if we're trying to make our program better, how does it always answer that it affects recruiting new students? And, we don't use the word retaining students. We use the words re-recruit. So I should always be re-recruiting students or re-recruiting our staff if they're good staff members. But how does it affect recruiting? And then how does it affect winning? And then if we can answer and hit those two, then we'll move on with it. One of the things that I like to do, and I don't want to call it a game, but when somebody tells me about their culture, or they're going to be the best recruiters, that I've ever seen, or, our culture is like, okay, that's awesome. Can you tell me your 1-year plan of implementing that? And following up with, okay, what's the plan to, do things the right way? Okay, if we're going to do things the right way, what are your top 3 aspects, and what does that entail that are core values of yours? So really identifying and honing in on those things of like, okay, what's your 1-year recruiting plan? What's your 12-month, 6-month leadership journey to develop these young men and women as great leaders? And I think it's really just, to answer your question, the follow-up question, and not just letting it go by the wayside of, hey, we're going to do things the right way. Okay, what does that mean to you? Like, define that for me, and I've gotten really great answers. Us doing things the right way is the hard way. It's usually not the easy way, and they can explain all that. And then that's when I really know, okay, we're onto something here.
Yeah, really, really cool. Last question to get you out of here on, and we'll stay on the interviewing topic. Yeah. Talk about just some of the commonalities of some of the successful hires that you've made, just kind of like either what stood out to them in the interview process as you were kind of evaluating them, or maybe kind of what stood out to them once they got on campus, just to kind of talk about the successes that you've had in hiring.
Yeah, so I'm going through my Rolodex and thinking in my brain, because
You're going to get in trouble naming names. You don't have to name names, but
well, you said it earlier, like every sport, every situation is different. And, I don't want to use just like a simple, easy buzzword that people latch on to. But I think the biggest thing for me is their passion to help men and women grow. And so, like, look, I know you're passionate about the sport. I know you're passionate about recruiting. I know you're passionate about, college athletics, but how is your passion to be a positive influence? And what does that, really mean to you? For me, because I know I'm passionate about that, that's where some commonalities I think have been, rather than just saying, passion to the sport and selling themselves. To me, is how are we going to invest in those around us? That's what I think for me has really been some commonalities. And then how are you going to sell that to, and then follow up with it as well?
yeah, love that. And such great perspective to get us out of here on. I think all the time about you talked about passion, and like I always view, whether I was on the football field or the work I do now, is like I wanted to be a positive difference maker in those people's lives. And I think coaching kind of is a calling for like significance in those people's lives and in the development of teams and of those people. And I think sometimes like I'm saying football, but sports gets a little results oriented in the way that we view things. I'm thinking of a coach that just recently retired, did great things for his program, and yet like no players are kind of coming to his aid after the fact, or saying that this coach was done wrong by being let go. And to me, that kind of said a lot. It's like, yeah, your program had a ton of success, but like, to what end? Like, so you get a free meal at the Mexican restaurant in town. Like the significance of being that influence and that positive difference maker in those people's lives, I think, is why I got into coaching, and I think one of the commonalities that you see in all the successful coaches.
Yeah, I believe that to the core. That's absolutely right.
Yep. Well, Hunter, thank you so much for joining me today. This was great. Love nerding out on all this stuff, just kind of, the admin of being a first-year head coach and the interview process. So thank you so much for joining me here today, man.
Man, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Best of luck to you. Sting 'em.